Hey everyone, Chris here with a filler video that's a little out of sequence, but this is something I've been wanting to showcase for a number of weeks now after I was reminded of how I originally played The Elder Scrolls Chapter 4 Oblivion. Now I'm going to guess a lot of people who watch my videos have played or at least seen this game in some fashion or another. And regardless of if you like the game or not, there's no denying just how good it looked on high-end hardware or even mid-range hardware back when it came out in 2006. There's just one little catch. This is how it looked when I first played this game. Okay, this is going to take some explaining. For the latter half of the 2000s, I had next to no spending cash whatsoever. As a result of that, I was stuck using Windows 98 a lot longer than the average person would have. And thus, when Oblivion came out, I met most of the minimum system requirements, just barely, save for that one spec, as Oblivion stated that it required Windows XP. Well, over a year went by, and then as I'm walking through an office supply store for some basic things I needed, I spotted the Game of the Year edition of Oblivion on a small gaming software shelf for 20 bucks, and I was just like, screw it, I'm gonna buy it now, and if it doesn't work, I'm just gonna save it for later. And sure enough, I get home, try to run it, and it didn't work. Here's the thing though, it installed. The installation went by without a hitch, and even the launcher was working right, but as soon as I tried to launch the game, I would get an error message about a missing function in a particular DLL file. But what was weird about that was that it was a system DLL file, like not something which came with Oblivion. I tried to figure out more about said missing function, and it turned out that Windows 98 does indeed have that same function present, but in a different DLL file. The entire inability to play Oblivion on Windows 98 is simply down to certain system functions being in different DLL files, which naturally I felt was really stupid, and thus I was convinced there had to be a way to get this working. So, say hello to Kernel EX. Kernel EX hasn't been updated in many years now, but the original goal of the Kernel EX project was to backport some of the functionality of later Windows operating systems into Windows 98, thus allowing for Windows 98 to continue to function as someone's main operating system with more modern software, at least up to the point where this stopped being updated. So I tried it out. I downloaded it, installed it, tried running Oblivion, and yeah, so even though I met the minimum system specs and the launcher put me into low detail mode, my frame rate was about 2. Naturally, this wasn't going to cut it, but at least I had it working, right? So the trick now was to just start going through detail settings and turning them as far down as I could. But the problem here was that they were already pretty much set as low as they could go. What else was there to do? And this had really confused me at first because I remember in the launcher there was this little option right here which said very low. But the launcher had detected my graphics card, an underpowered GeForce FX 5200, comparable in power to a GeForce 2 but with more shader functions, and automatically decided that low was the default setting I should be running. Yet low already had everything turned down to minimum. Like, again, what other things could be done to make it even lower? So I clicked that very low button, kept my screen resolution high, tried running the game again, and now it looked like this. But hey, I actually had a decent frame rate now. It wasn't perfect outdoors, but it was totally playable. And so here's what's actually happening. Oblivion's low detail setting is specifically meant for low-end but modern GPUs for when this game came out, so something more akin to a GeForce 7300 or such. The FX 5200 was a bad card even when it came out, but it was cheap, and when I got it, I needed something right away to replace my dying GeForce 2 card. I didn't have a ton of money to spend, so that's how I ended up with that. But because cards like mine were still out there, that's what the very low detail option in Oblivion is specifically for, as hitting that button completely disables all fragment shaders. To clarify, modern graphics cards since the early 2000s split up rendering duties into miniature programs called shaders. Now, as cards got more advanced, more kinds of fundamental shader types were created, but back at this juncture, where DirectX topped out at version 9.0c, there were only two kinds of shaders, vertex and fragment. Basically, when the graphics card is told to render a particular object, if that object has shader programs attached, those shaders will be run as the rendering takes place. In particular, vertex shaders are designed to alter vertex properties during rendering, thus allowing for more advanced effects without having to actually alter the mesh itself, while fragment shaders are run on each individual pixel being rendered, thus why they're also sometimes referred to as pixel shaders. The trick, though, is that fragment shaders were still fairly young. Like, if you scroll back to Morrowind, the third Elder Scrolls game, it did indeed have support for fragment shaders, but used them for one and only one thing: water. That's literally it. Morrowind was so early in supporting fragment shaders that it couldn't get away with using them for any necessary graphical fidelity, since only the high-end graphics cards could handle them, and even then they couldn't handle much, as fragment shaders were still very expensive in terms of GPU power consumed. Thus, Morrowind used them solely to make water effects more real. If you turned off the fragment shaders, the game would still look exactly as it normally would. The water would just basically be a simple translucent texture. Oblivion, however, came out several graphics card generations later. By this point, high-end games were making liberal use of fragment shaders to produce more realistic lighting effects, mesh fading effects, which allowed for distant landscapes to be rendered, more complex shadow and bump mapping. The graphics cards were now powerful enough to handle this kind of quantity of fragment shaders, and were optimized with this in mind, as the raw texture and mesh processing performances hadn't really increased all that much. It did go up, just not anywhere near to the same extent as the shader capabilities did. To that end, a lot of advanced effects, which used to be handled with complex algorithms and often broke down between hardware revisions, things like lighting and shadows, could now be easily handled by a fragment shader with minimal effort, and thus, that's what Oblivion did. And that's why it looks like this when you turn the shaders off. No one bothered to make compatible lighting systems or shadow systems or mesh fading systems because the expectation was you could just use the shaders, and the only people who would need non-shader equivalents were going to be stuck on low-end hardware anyways, so what was even the point? And that's how Oblivion ended up with its very low detail option. It's there primarily as a backup for people who had older video cards which just couldn't handle the sheer quantity of shader programs in use in Oblivion, because that was the only real bottleneck. When you turn the shaders off, all that's left is the raw textures and meshes, seen as virtually nothing is being handled without them. The irony being, you can try turning certain detail settings back on while in the game, but without the shaders running, they either won't work at all, won't render correctly, or can flat out crash the program entirely. In fact, I remember that when I first tried to go outside of the starting dungeon with these settings in place, the game was constantly crashing, and it turned out that despite all of this, one of the ways water was processed outside of the shaders was incompatible with my video card. So there was yet another setting I had to manually change in the configuration files to stop that crash from happening. In the end, I actually played quite a bit of the game with it looking like this, because, well, when it comes down to it, it may look wrong, but it's still the same game. In fact, there's only really one functional difference as a result of playing it this way compared to having proper lighting, and that's the lighting. One of the things most people remember about Oblivion is that some of the dungeons in this game get very dark. Now, if you were running a high-end graphics card with HDR support, then this wasn't as big a deal because HDR naturally makes it easier to see in dark areas. But if HDR wasn't an option for you, or if you wanted to have anti-aliasing going on, since Oblivion's HDR support is not compatible alongside anti-aliasing, then you were stuck with bloom lighting, which wasn't really all that good and often made bright things look way too bright and dark things look way too dark. However, with the shaders disabled, everything's just sort of a flat brightness at all times. This means you don't have to constantly hold torches or use light spells or night eye spells to see what you're doing. You just see everything. Now, in some ways, this may seem like a cheat, but having played the game quite a bit like this, I have to say, it's not as big of a cheat as you think it is. The stuff does stand out better, but the challenge of the game is still the same as always. It just doesn't look so good. Though speaking of the challenge, just a quick little tangent here is that Oblivion launched with dynamic difficulty scaling, but a result of that is that quite frequently players would hit specific levels and all of a sudden the difficulty of everything would just skyrocket. You'd be taking things out in just a few swings prior and then suddenly everything starts taking 100 swings, not exaggerating. A result of this was that they added a difficulty slider, which basically is just a multiplier on how much damage hostile targets dish out and how much damage hostile targets take. However, this difficulty slider has an extreme effect. Put it all the way to the right and you won't be able to hurt anything. Put it all the way to the left and almost everything will die in one hit from virtually any attack. However, if you click on the arrows which cap the sides of this difficulty bar, you can adjust it by single points. And me personally, I found that all you have to do to make the difficulty in this game more sane and more balanced is to just drop it by 3 clicks of that left arrow. I'm dead serious. 3 tiny points off of the difficulty makes this game way better. And if you don't believe me, give it a try. Just remember to set the difficulty back to default first before you do this, since once you've changed it, you kind of don't have a good way of seeing where the center point is anymore, and that's kind of important. Anyways, I don't really have much more to say about the functional differences here, so let's just end with a few more comparisons, such as with some of the shopkeepers in the Imperial City. Now, one of the first you're likely going to meet on any playthrough is Jensine, as she runs the general store, or rather the good as new merchandise store. A fairly sharp difference here, especially with those deer head mounts, which stand out a lot more with the lighting casting them in shadow. Actually, if we do a close-up of her face while going through the persuasion minigame, it's interesting to see how much detail is lost without the shaders in play. Yet it's also interesting to see which details are not lost, such as how the translucency in the hair is simply handled with basic alpha channel blending. And heck, even with modern game engines, for sake of optimization, you generally don't handle translucency directly at the shader level. You instead define your object as being translucent or not, and then that simply becomes another value you can tweak inside your shader if you wish to. Here in Edgar's discount spells, we don't really see much of a huge difference as there's not much going on in here, though it is curious to note that the specular blobs on the glassware are being rendered despite no shaders being in effect. DirectX 9 did indeed support certain basic rendering principles like specular highlights without having to use shaders. Now here we are in the best defense, which isn't too dramatic of a change either, though if we step into the Gilded Carafe, not only is the place lit up by all the candles to a massive degree, but take a look at this table here with the potions and hourglass on top. Now I was just saying how the specular blob was appearing on the glassware before, but it's only appearing on translucent glassware, like with the hourglass, whereas for anything opaque like the potions, the specular highlights are clearly being handled by the shaders instead. Now let's take a nighttime walk from the city gates and go exploring. At least it's clearly a nighttime walk with the shaders going. Without the shaders going, the only way you'd know this was night was due to the sky texture. During this walk, it also becomes very apparent just how much multi-texturing there is in the landscape to get things like dirt paths and stuff to look more natural. A multi-texturing is where 2 or more textures are faded between on the same surface, and this can be handled in a variety of ways, some of which don't involve shaders, so I think that's one of the options you can re-enable with the shaders off and still have it look right. But since I'm not doing this recording off of a real Windows 98 machine, I had no way to confirm that. Actually, while we're taking this walk, I do want to point out a couple interesting snags I ran into trying to make this video to demonstrate all of this. The first is that Oblivion doesn't like being run in a window on modern hardware. If you're running at full screen, you're going to run into few issues, if any. But when I tried to run this in a window, everything was running slightly too fast, leading to dialogue getting clipped among other issues. Not sure exactly what was up with that, but if I went into my graphics driver settings and assigned a hard 60 FPS cap, that fixed the problem. So yeah, running Oblivion in a window on modern systems, make sure to give it a hard frame cap. The other interesting snag was in just trying to record it at all, as for some reason I wasn't able to capture the game's internal rendering buffer directly, as I can with most other games. Which means you may or may not have been seeing the occasional stutter, which normally wouldn't be there. And for full screen, I had to get it to record the entire desktop. And for windowed, I had to grab the window contents, but I had to do it without the mouse cursor, as Oblivion doesn't use the system cursor. Now heck, it actually makes the system cursor disappear without locking it into the window, meaning if you hover this invisible cursor over things outside of the window, it'll cause hovering actions to trigger outside of the program. Though you won't be able to click on anything, as it at least locks out that functionality properly. Now here's a quick walk through the town of Skingrad at night, which is one of the least affected by having the shaders disabled, much to my surprise. though it definitely feels more atmospheric with the lights doing their job. I did expect this difference to be a bit more pronounced, but it goes to show how good you can make something look even without full resolution textures or advanced lighting. Heck, when they were making Morrowind, they were bragging about how they didn't need to use advanced tricks like bump mapping and such because the graphics were just that good. Though Morrowind was also one of the first games ever made to require 24-bit or 32-bit color, so yeah, Elder Scrolls games have a history of interesting minimum system requirements. And lastly, what would a demonstration of Oblivion in this manner be without taking a trip into Oblivion itself? As we make the trek up the side of this hill, you'll notice the sky textures are doing their thing properly, though the gate itself looks way more menacing with the shaders going, as the shaders are able to warp the pixels around them. And then once we head through to Oblivion itself, yeah, this one doesn't actually look that bad, comparatively speaking. With the proper lighting in place, there's a definite feel of desolation and dreariness, yet without the proper lighting, you can actually see the detail in the textures more clearly, especially given that there isn't a red cast over everything. It almost makes me feel like they may have just gone a little too overboard with the color grading in here with the shaders, and that Oblivion may have looked better if they scaled that back a bit. But hey, hindsight is 20/20. This game came out at a time when using shaders to power graphics engines was still a novel concept, and thus developers were still finding their footing with this newfangled tech. With all of the details maxed out, a lot of Oblivion looks really good. And I mean the game as a whole, not Oblivion here. But every once in a while you come across some minor little detail which seems like they didn't quite get it right, because chances are they didn't. Yet when you have all of those shaders disabled and you can see the raw graphics that were being worked with, it's kind of eye-opening just how ahead of the curve this kind of rendering methodology was. And yet nowadays it's shaders for everything. Not even texturing is done without shaders anymore. I mean, you can, the libraries still support the legacy functions to do so, but it's just not the optimal way to do it thanks to how rendering has evolved over time. And while we've lost a lot of interesting graphical wizardry coming from then to now, tricks which were needed to make games look as good as they did given the lack of hardware support for the things they wanted to do, where we've ended up is a lot more accessible to average people with a lot of power at any developer's fingertips for a minimal amount of effort. But it's still interesting seeing this example of a game which was both pushing new ground, yet allowing for legacy support all at the same time. Anywho, that'll be all for today's filler video. Next up for Ancient DOS Games will be a proper review, episode 308, debuting 2 Saturdays from now on February 4th, where we're going to be taking a look at a game which plays kinda like a city building game, except quite a bit more festive than that. So be sure to stay tuned to see what game I've got lined up for everyone. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me over on Patreon. If you'd also like to support the show directly and get some extra perks, then head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.